In the 1936 presidential election, FDR had benefited from a lot of clout in trying to help the American society come out from the doldrums of the Depression by enacting sweeping amounts of New Deal policies that would help people. He was widely popular with the American public. And the Republican Party at that time didn't really offer any viable alternatives, and they kind of knew it. It was going to be a foregone conclusion that FDR would win the 1936 election, and he did in a pretty big landslide. Wasn't really any sort of question. Okay? So, FDR wins that election, and it helps Democrats obtain a broad coalition of the American population that still lingers quite significantly to this day. So, you had farmers who were helped by FDR. Farmers liked him. You have the urban working class, oftentimes unemployed, now being put into work through government agencies. They liked FDR. The poor and other unemployed benefited similarly. You have white Southerners who are now working the Tennessee Valley Authority. They benefited. Typically, they like to vote Democrat anyway at that time. Well, now they have a special reason to, as that was cemented through things like the TVA. And then, of course, traditional progressives who want to see various different implementations in society to be overall beneficial. That entire group and swath of people largely supported not just FDR, but the Democratic Party as a whole back then. So expansion of government to help a broad base amount of people was something that really appealed. So FDR and the Democrats made up a substantial majority of the electorate. Now, that's not to say things were perfect. FDR, as was president, saw a lot of backlash from various different segments, but he also was blocked by the Supreme Court. As we talked about a few slides back, we talked about how the Supreme Court became involved in making sure that the federal government didn't overstep its bounds in certain ways with its enactments. So, FDR really targeted the Supreme Court because he didn't like how he was seeing so much opposition from the conservative judges, at least, who held the majority. So, FDR's idea was that he would pack the Supreme Court with judges who'd be more favorable to his cause. He wanted to add to the number of Supreme Court judges and then nominate judges that were favorable to him. That's called court packing. That's what he wanted to do. Ultimately, it was recognized by his opposition and even people who liked FDR. They saw what he was trying to do, and there was quite a significant opposition from Congress about it. So, court packing and FDR's attempt to kind of gain favor with the Supreme Court kind of led to a little bit of his downfall. Not in the long term, but it was something that created enough opposition to where people lost a little bit of confidence in FDR at that time. So it was something that damaged FDR's administration, at least in the short term. Okay, there would be other things that would definitely help. Furthermore, as we reached the mid to late mid 1930s, FDR saw enough economic improvement to where he felt he could cut some government spending in some of the different programs that he had enacted a few years prior so as to balance the budget. The problem is, America still wasn't strong enough to overcome some of those budget cuts just yet. One of the things that's known about economic policy and is popular under the Keynesian theory of economics is that in a recession, the government should spend money to keep things going, and then once the economy recovers, then you increase taxes to collect your losses from prior years. That's a Keynesian theory of macroeconomics, and it was largely applied by FDR until he started to cut things. He cut spending to balance the budget. And in that particular instance, by cutting the WPA in half, that put anywhere from 2 to 4 million people back out onto the streets out of work. Okay, that's going to sting. That's going to reverse the improving economic condition and it's going to bring it back to some of the levels of the early 1930s. So that's going to create another recession within the Depression. You're trying to build from out of it, now you're going right back to where you were. So you start to see FDR's New Deal go into a little bit of a disarray because he created a recession because he was cutting government spending. So effectively, by the late 1930s, you saw the New Deal come to its end when it had enough congressional opposition. And then, of course, there were other international affairs that were looming large in the 1930s, which we're about to talk about. Okay? So ultimately, we're going to talk about the legacy of the New Deal shortly, but it's starting to meet a little bit of its demise.